Hello, I'm Andreas Umland and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. It's been another hectic day in Ukraine with literally dozens, if not hundreds, of enemy projectiles making their way towards cities all across the country. The resulting situation has even forced Poland to actually scramble its fighter jets to ensure the safety of neighboring regions, as some of the missiles have made their way further into western Ukraine, a place which normally is less intensely attacked by the Russians than other parts of the country. Now, this has, of course, given rise to plenty of speculation on how to protect Ukrainian skies and whether countries other than Ukraine should become more involved. But will it happen? What are the obstacles to such a solution? Well, we're going to talk about that with our guest today. Andreas Umland, analyst at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, is joining us now. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me again. Hello from Kyiv.
So, if you're staying in Kyiv right now, perhaps, let us begin with a first-hand account. What is the situation there now? And was the night really that difficult in terms of air raid alarms, which tend to sound whenever there are enemy missiles approaching the city?
Well, this morning there were actually quite loud explosions in Kyiv, and quite a few. As far as I know, all of the ballistic and cruise missiles have been intercepted. So these were explosions from hits of these missiles rather than hits by these missiles into Kyiv. But it was quite loud, and the city was, of course, very alert here and afraid. Although one still has to say this is nothing compared to what cities like Kharkiv or Sumy or other frontline cities are going through.
And Kharkiv, again, civilian targets were attacked, including a sports center. Would you care to comment on that? I mean, of course, it is fairly predictable because Russia tends to do it all the time, but still we need to emphasize that this is the tactic that they're using.
Yes, that seems to be the approach, to terrorize the civilian population so much that the civilians will either leave Ukraine or they will pressure the government to make concessions to Russia. In fact, one could argue that now peace negotiations and a ceasefire would actually make sense for Ukraine, because now there could be a real deal. As Ukraine has now occupied also Russian territory, one could simply try to get an exchange of everything against everything, all territories against all territories, all deported children against all deported children, although I don't know of any Russian children that have been deported to Ukraine, all prisoners of war against all prisoners of war. There's now actually a situation where negotiations would make sense, but there's not enough pressure from countries like China, India, those countries that de facto support the Russian war on Russia to enter negotiations.
Yes, I do believe that the deportation of children has been an exclusively Russian strategy to actually exert further pressure, but also to basically deprive the Ukrainian territories of their youth and take these children into Russian territory, indoctrinating them into becoming Russian citizens. Now, you've mentioned countries which could actually exert pressure on Russia. Do you think that India could perhaps play a role here, given that the cooperation between Russia and China, perhaps not necessarily something that India would like to see?
I'm afraid India may have not enough instruments by itself. As far as I understood, the Indian position, and Modi just visited Kyiv a week ago. India wants actually peace, but India alone may not have enough leverage. The key actor here is indeed China, and I also suspect that within China, within the Chinese leadership, especially the economic section of the leadership, there is perhaps a faction that would like this war to end, because the war is also affecting Chinese economic interests indirectly, but still. But as long as China is not really actually fulfilling what it is actually promoting publicly. China has officially a position that respects Ukrainian territorial integrity, that is in favor of a ceasefire, that is in favor of negotiations. But when now push comes to shove, when we now have actually a situation where Ukraine probably would enter negotiations and where a ceasefire on all front lines, also on the front line within Russia, would be acceptable. China is not doing that because perhaps the faction within the Chinese leadership that wants a continuation of the war and a Russian victory is stronger than the dovish, let's call it that way, faction in the Chinese leadership.
So there is no momentum towards real negotiation, apart from the fact that negotiation would actually require Russia to act in good faith, which it seldom does. But let's actually focus now on the question of these missile attacks. As you've mentioned, Kyiv was under a barrage of missiles, other cities as well. There has always been the question of shooting down these missiles, especially if they approach NATO territory. So far, most comments were negative. But what we do have right now, a very important, I believe, interview given by Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski to the Financial Times, which was published earlier today. And let me give you a quote from that interview. Membership in NATO does not trump each country's responsibility for the protection of its own airspace. It is our own constitutional duty. And also, I'm personally of the view that when hostile missiles are on course of entering our airspace, it would be legitimate self-defense to strike them, because once they do cross into our airspace, the risk of debris injuring someone is significant. End of quote. Do you think that perhaps this does signify a slow, gradual shift in perception? First, NATO countries of the eastern flank, perhaps later on, also other countries might actually reconsider.
One would hope so, and this would actually help Ukraine if, let's say, Poland would shoot down Russian missiles going either through Poland or also passing by near Poland or going into the direction of Poland. That would already be a substantial help, as far as I understand, and would actually free also Ukrainian resources that could then be deployed in other parts of the country that need air protection more than the western part of the country. So one hopes that this will finally happen. I think there's also a very good argument here from Western countries to create no-fly zones over nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and to enforce them by their own weaponry and with their own armies, rather than relying simply on the Ukrainian armed forces, because the nuclear power plants, their safety is of course in the vital interests of not just the Ukrainian population but also the populations of NATO member countries. And there are other arguments that could be made for such, let's call it, no-fly zones over Ukraine.
But no-fly zones would require a greater degree of involvement, right? But when we consider missiles and drones flying dangerously close to the borders of NATO countries, why is there even talk of escalation? I mean, we would be technically shooting down unmanned vehicles, no casualties involved. I mean, things like that happened before on, that went beyond this. Turkey shot down a Russian jet once. That was not unmanned. There was a risk of casualties. Was there a world war, Turkey being a member of NATO? I can't remember anything like that happening. Basically, Russia backed down. So why are we still talking about escalation risks in this particular context?
Yes, this is really surprising. I think the reason is plain fear on the side of the West, and that is, of course, also a fear that is very well felt in the Kremlin, and that encourages the Kremlin to escalate further, and this reluctance even to protect our own citizens, our own borders, our own territorial our own territories. This is really surprising, and it's a signal of weakness. And as you rightly said, for more than 2 years, I think that there's never been a Russian plane with a pilot actually coming within Ukraine, close to Western Ukraine. There's basically no air war happening over Ukraine in the sense of pilots fighting each other over Western Ukraine. So there's no risk here actually of killing a Russian soldier, something that Turkey has done in 2015, as you rightly mentioned, and Turkey has done that not over Turkish territory, but over Syrian territory, because the Turkish airplane was, before it entered the Syrian territory, passing through Turkish territory. So we could do that, but for some reason we don't, and it's I don't think there's a rational explanation for that. It's just plain fear.
And also, Minister Sikorski gives a practical explanation there why we perhaps might want to do that. These missiles and drones, they tend to approach at a higher altitude above Ukraine, and then they descend as they approach targets near the border. So if we shoot them down at a higher altitude, the risk of fallout becomes lower, because the debris are scattered, they are not concentrated in one specific area. The explosion is happening also further above ground, so that reduces the risk of accidental casualties.
Yes, and we had this incident about a year ago when that was at least the story. Ukraine was shooting down Russian missiles, and then somehow the debris ended up on Polish territory and killed 2 Polish citizens on Polish territory. And so if Poland would shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory, this would not happen anymore. So there's a very good argument to do that, and then to also help Ukraine in defending itself.
So finally, one quick question. Do you think that the recent appeal of Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba for further air defense systems to be released to Ukraine will be heeded? He said that Patriot systems were promised by Ukraine's allies, but they are not being backfilled. The US is not delivering them. Do you think that these efforts will now pick up the pace?
I would hope so. So, for instance, Germany has been spending so far 0.1% of its GDP for the support of Ukraine, and other Western countries.
It's still the second biggest country in terms of overall support, isn't it?
Yes. Well, yeah, but that's because the German economy is large, but still, in relative terms, it's very little, and some Western countries have, in relative terms, even spent less than Germany. So this is a bizarre situation. We have the largest war in Europe since 1945, and most countries in Europe simply don't care. They make announcements, and they do help Ukraine to a certain degree, but they don't actually help Ukraine to win. And winning here simply means that Ukraine restores its territorial integrity, although they have the resources. It's all there. It's much larger than the Russian resources, but they are not spent because somehow the war is not really perceived as a war, but as a regional conflict, and as not related really to Europe. So yeah, it's a bizarre situation, and one would think that the self-interest of these countries would drive them to support Ukraine more resolutely. And they have the stuff, they have the kit. We have lots of armies and with lots of technology, and most of these equipment will never be used, although it has been built originally to fight the Russian army.
No,
I
of
mean,
course,
that
it
is
has
the
been
big-
reduced after the Cold War ended, and also Patriot missiles. Now, these are mostly in the hands of the United States. That's another story altogether, but again, the question of self-interest in delivering them and ending the war in Ukraine's favor. Andreas Umland was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thanks.
And I'm Jonasz Rewnicki. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.